You need to be engaged in your divorce. A big mistake is I hired a great attorney, they'll take care of everything. You do need to be engaged, but at the same time, you need to be gentle, you need to be deliberate and focused, and you need to look beyond the divorce and plan for beyond. As you said in the intro, this is the first chapter of the rest of your life, not the last chapter in that part of your life.
That's amazing advice. And as you were saying this, it kind of reminds me of business school, where I think it was in my marketing class. Our professor always said to us, you're going to negotiate a deal that you're going to feel okay about. No one's going to feel great with the deal that they have. If that's the case, it's always one-sided, and that causes problems further down the line. Hi there, and welcome to the Conscious Divorce Podcast. I'm Justin Milrad, certified divorce coach, MBA, financial planner, and founder of Reclaim and Reboot Divorce Coaching. This is a show where we explore divorce not as an ending, but as a launch pad for the life you're meant to live. We talk about the real stuff, the messy middle, the hard questions, and the transformative possibilities that emerge when you approach divorce with intention and awareness. Before we dive in, here is my disclaimer. I'm a divorce coach, not an attorney, not a financial advisor, not a therapist. Nothing we discuss on this podcast is direct legal, financial, or therapeutic advice. This show is about education, information you should know, inspiration, and giving you frameworks to think differently about your divorce. You may want to work with qualified professionals, including attorneys, financial advisors, and therapists who can guide you through specific situations. What we offer here is perspective, strategy, and the mindset work that makes everything else more effective. Today's episode is one I wish every single person considering divorce would listen to before they take action. We're talking about the money wake-up call, the things that no one tells you to prepare before you file. And I brought in an expert who sees financial carnage that happens when people aren't prepared. Joining me today is Hirsh Sermon with Lifecycle Financial, LLC. Hirsh works with individuals and families navigating major financial transitions, and divorce is one of the most complex financial events anyone will ever face. He's seen firsthand what happens when people are prepared versus when they're flying blind. And today he's going to walk us through exactly what you need to know before you file. Now, most people think divorce starts when you file papers. That couldn't be further from the truth. The groundwork you lay before filing, especially the financial groundwork, will help determine whether you emerge from this process financially stable or financially devastated. We're going to break down the essential documents you need to gather, the budgets you need to create, and the blind spots you need to eliminate, and the mistakes that cost people thousands of dollars simply because they didn't know what they didn't know. So grab a notebook. This is going to be practical, tactical, and possibly the most important 45 minutes you spend in your divorce preparation. So let's get into it. Hirsh, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great to have you. Let's start with the reality check. Nearly 3 million people get divorced every year in this country. And you want to know what the number one fear is? It's not the emotional stuff. It's not the kids. It's financial survival. Will I be okay? Can I make it on my own financially? And here's what I see all the time in my coaching practice. People don't realize they're financially unprepared until they're neck deep into the process. Once they filed, they're in discovery, and suddenly they're scrambling to find documents, trying to remember what accounts exist, realizing they don't know what anything is worth or where the money's coming from or tax information. So before we get into this checklist of what to do, let's talk about what goes wrong. Hirsh, in your experience, what's the biggest financial blind spot people have when they first come to thinking about divorce?
There's a couple big ones. One of them, obviously, is there's a huge disparity of information. Usually there's one of the spouses actually managing the money. One spouse controls the money very often. The other one's completely in the dark. That's one of them. Not understanding their full picture. A lot of people come to me and they don't understand marital assets and the claims on marital assets versus separate assets. Somebody talks about my retirement account and I don't know any different. I think it's theirs, right? It's not always the case, obviously. So understanding all of these pieces, your financial situation, getting up to speed on the education side, you had mentioned perfectly how it's not about the emotions, but boy, do they play in. And that's an important piece for people to think about as well. It's not the kind of thing you're just going to figure out later. The other piece that they're very blindsided about is even though they may do the grocery shopping and a lot of the pieces of the finances, in that respect, they're not the ones paying the bills and reconciling. And so they really have no idea what their what their current budget looks like. And they certainly don't know that beyond the divorce, what their budget's going to look like as well. And I think that's something we'll come back to, because that's an important piece to understand going through the divorce versus otherwise. And then people just thinking they know more than they do. Very often, I say this all the time, the vast majority of the time, men are managing the finances. It doesn't mean they're doing it well. So sometimes, even though you are more familiar with it, you really may not understand. And divorce is a very different animal. It's not the regular, let's pay our bills, let's put 10 or 15% of our income into savings. It really needs to be deliberate and strategic financially.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Even thinking through my own divorce, where we had to create our own budget for going through the divorce because we weren't living together, but also being really practical about what the future looks like. And you really don't have any idea how much you spend per month. And we all have to, as part of the legal process, fill out something called a domestic relations financial affidavit. And it's critical to not forget everything. So there's obviously the big things, your rent, car leases or education costs and things like that. But there's also the other 20% that you don't think about that really adds up. The advice my lawyer always said was, get it right, because this is what you're going to be negotiating.
And I'm just going to say one other piece to this, which is so critical in line with what you're saying. If I asked you, how much did you earn last year? I bet you could tell me. If I asked you, how much did you spend last year? I get a lot of blank looks when I ask that question.
Yep. I believe that. So let's get practical here in terms of preparation. So you've worked with probably hundreds of people, preparing for divorce. So when someone comes to you and says, I'm thinking about divorce, or I've just filed, what homework do you give them? What documents do they need to gather? And what are kind of the essential things that you require to build a true financial picture?
Generally, I look at a 3-year span to see what's been happening. I've had cases where somebody says to me, the marriage really broke down 2 years ago and we've just been trudging through it. I might go back a little bit longer, because if that other spouse knows the marriage was over and they controlled finances, they may be playing games over the last 2 years, and a 3-year look might not really be adequate. So a 3-year generally. I start with a lot of documents. I like to look at the tax returns, and not just your first 2 pages, the 1040. All of the other documents are really the juicy pieces for me to look at and get a sense of what assets are there, how much, things like that. Stubs are great. W-2s, 1099s are good, but if you have a year-end pay stub, there's so much detail on that that's not on a W-2. All sources of income are going to be important. So sometimes that might mean I need a employment contract. I might need awards, stock awards, whether it's options, RSUs. There are letters that come out, award letters, they call them, describing how many you're getting, vesting over how long. These are all things that people often forget about, but are so important. And 3 years helps me build a trend. Because if somebody says, oh, I'm earning X dollars today, I'm going to make up a number, $500,000. That sounds good, but I don't know, has that been trending up? And that's something we need to think about. How do we take that trend, and will that trend continue? That's going to play into things like true ups or other things that might come into place. So we need to understand the history, but how that's going to also look going forward.
Sure. Absolutely. And the most common question I get from clients, it's mostly women, are, am I going to be okay? And, the point that you brought about spending is really important, because I've had clients whose spouses, or joint incomes 7 figures, but so is their spending. So it's really important to truly understand that. So here's another question. What are some of the most commonly overlooked income documents that come back later?
Yeah, some of the ones that I've just said, the stock awards, like the RSUs, those restricted stock units, or equity compensation, or bonus, what future bonuses or deferred compensation is going to look like. Those are huge. A lot of people forget. They look at a W-2 and they say, again, let's just say 500,000. But if you really look at the numbers, they're not thinking, well, did they put $30,000 into okay, and was part of that matched? And so there's a lot of pieces that, even if you have a document, if you don't know how to read it, you're going to miss a lot of the information, right? Business income for self-employed is huge. I find all the time, especially small businesses, there's a lot of things passed through the business. that are personal expenses. We need to back those out. We need to identify as much of that as possible. I had somebody once literally paying a $3,800 mortgage through their through the business. If you think about that, that's a $40,000 expense they were taking that wasn't a legitimate expense. That's a lot. That plays into your alimony, that plays into your child support. All of these things are important. Expense accounts, something that's huge. This is a trick people play. We in December now, somebody knew that they were getting divorced because they filed in February or January, which is the biggest month. I might go into payroll and say, I'm going to take another $300 a paycheck out of my paycheck for withholdings. Well, if we get divorced before the end of the year, I've just withheld thousands of dollars that I'm going to get back in a refund. You're not even going to know about it. There might be commissions, cryptocurrency, those cashless apps like Venmo, Cash App, all of those. These are all major ones. The other one that people forget about is if somebody's getting a K1, as an example, they might be getting, it's called passive income. They're not engaged, but they've invested in that. That is another one because there might be a couple $100,000 that's been invested in a company, but you're only seeing, I don't know, let's say $5,000 a year in income from that. Those are all things that people are forgetting about that are just vital. All of a sudden, you could literally have another $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 if you put them all together.
Yep. No question about that. I've seen that time after time. And that's why working with a professional like you pays off exponentially. So if you were going to work with a new client and, let's say they're semi-literate financially, what documents do you tell them that they need to collect for your first meeting, to kind of develop perhaps a marital balance sheet?
So a marital balance sheet is huge. I'm glad you brought that up. That is one of the major tools to use going through your divorce. Basically, you're putting everything on one page. It's going to be everything you own and everything that's debt. So it's going to be bank statements, brokerage statements, retirement accounts, life insurance that potentially has cash value, properties, businesses. I always put, and I separate them, your marital and your non-marital assets. I think it's important to understand that, especially if you're in an equitable state, equitable distribution state, which is, I don't know, somewhere around 37 of the states, vehicles, business ownership, appraisals on certain assets like real estate or collectibles or things like that. All of those on the asset side become huge. Very, very important. A lot of this you obviously can glean from the tax returns and things like that, but having the history of these items becomes very, very important. Also, this is again why we want to go back 3 years. I want to make sure if an account was closed 2 years ago for $1 million, wherever that money went, $1 million was put in, not 900,000. And who knows where that other 100,000 is. So again, looking at the larger picture and a little bit of that history becomes very, very important on that respect. The debt becomes very important as well. Mortgages, lines of credit, credit cards. It's important sometimes to pull credit reports. It tells you what accounts somebody has that they don't spring that on you at a later date that you had no idea. If they're loan documents, promissory notes, anything like that becomes very, very important. The other one that often is missing that people don't always think about or know about, if somebody takes a loan against their 401k, because that's cash that you get. It doesn't hit your tax return. And very often you'd be amazed at how often I see a spouse not know there was a $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 loan taken against a 401k that's being paid back.
Terrific. I'm just going to list a handful of assets that people forget. Many of them you mentioned. And if you can maybe speak to, when I'm done going through the list, some of the values or perhaps even some real stories and examples that you've seen. Yeah. Just to kind of emphasize that these are things that people don't want to forget.
Absolutely.
Digital assets, cryptocurrency, NFTs, domain names, digital marketplace accounts, deferred compensation. You talked about that a lot. Loyalty programs, things such as frequent flyer miles, hotel points, credit card rewards, accrued benefits, unused vacation and sick time that pays out can be worth lots of money. I've seen that worth hundreds and thousands of dollars in some cases. Business assets where valuations are important, safety deposit box content. So one of my favorite stories is someone found shares of Apple and Microsoft that were actually in certificates that were worth millions of dollars that had they not gone to their joint a safety deposit box they would have never found, which was incredible. Things like timeshares and club memberships, tax refunds and pending settlements, inheritance or trust distributions, season tickets, things like that. So any good examples there?
Absolutely. Deferred compensation, I know I touched on a lot, but one thing I do want to talk about that we didn't is the old style non-contributory pension plan. Those are plans where they're not based on your contributions and matches. They're based on your salary and your tenure. So the government is a perfect example. If you work for a government agency, let's say 20 years, you might get 75% of your income. Well, somebody who's been working for these companies very often, I'll give you one example. I have a client been working for a company 24 years, said he didn't have one. We discovered he did. It was going to be $42,000 a year, of which, again, this is getting a little technical, about 35 grand of that 42 every year was marital. That was basically $1,500 a month coming to her every month that she had no idea was going to come her way for the rest of her life. So one example, loyalty points is a great one. I had a client, they had 1.8 million because they had a small business. They put everything on credit cards. They had amassed 1.8 million. If you cash that in, is thousands of dollars worth of actual cash, let alone, in this case, we wanted 900,000 because she said, I'm never going to be able to take a vacation. If I've got 900,000 points, I can take vacations. That was her way to save cash flow, take vacations. Business assets is a huge one. We look at a business, but we sometimes forget maybe there's 50 or 70,000. I had a doctor, the client was my wife. He used to bring about 40 or 50 grand home in cash. All of a sudden he stopped bringing home cash. Well, now the business had almost 200 grand in cash. No one was thinking about that. Inheritances is a big one, especially with equitable distribution. You get a 3 or 4 million inheritance that's sitting on the side. It might make sense for the other party to say, hey, I want 60% of the assets. You've got another 3 million waiting for me. I can't touch. The one I want to add that you don't have here that I think is important, it's not that common, but it's the most expensive real estate on the property. And those are grave sites. If you bought a grave site, those can be very, very expensive. And quite honestly, do you want to be buried next to your spouse that you're now divorcing, right? Again, another one that's very commonly overlooked.
Yeah, no doubt. And something that I think everyone should be thinking about here, there's a good chance you're going to resolve your divorce in mediation. So the more tools you have and the value you place on them, really gives you greater leverage in terms of coming to a resolution in mediation instead of going to court. So let's talk about marital versus separate property and asset mapping. So you've gathered this mountain of documents. Now you have to figure out what's actually on the table for division, because not everything is. So this is where people get confused about marital versus separate property. This is where commingling can really hurt you. It hurt me terribly in my own personal divorce. And it's expensive if you don't really understand what this means. So Hirsh, can you kind of break down marital versus separate property in practical terms? What are the basic rules and what trips people up? And can you also talk about the commingling trap?
Absolutely. So again, neither one of us are lawyers, so this is practical information versus legal advice. But the basics of marital assets is what has been accumulated through the marriage. So we got married, I'm making this up, January 1st of 2000. Since January of 2000, what earnings have we saved? What 401ks, what properties, all the rest. That's effectively your marital property. Your separate property is basically everything outside of that, right? So did I have a bank account or a 401k before that? And I want to come back to the 401k. Or did I get an inheritance or was there a specific gift? Those are the kind of things that are going to be outside of the marriage or what they call separate, right? Non-marital. The 401k is an interesting one because if I'm with a company and I'm making this up, I got $100,000, we get married, we married for 20 years, I'm going to continue contributing to that. That is because we have to separate the premarital from the marital. That's not considered commingling, putting together, right? They don't have a separate, now you married 401k. It's all going to be in the same. So those are the things that we got to understand as well. That's another one, by the way, that a lot of people forget. We've been married 25 years. I'm not even thinking that I had money in a 401k or an IRA before that. And I've just continued on that. The commingling is when I take some of that separate property. Let's say I take an inheritance and I put it into our, so to speak, operating account, our general account together. And we use that money. That's basically commingling. Where it's not commingling is if I have $100,000 on the side that's been an inheritance and we want to do something and I take 10,000 out of it, it doesn't necessarily make it that the other 90,000 is now commingled. I've still kept that separate. But the caution I'm going to give everybody here, state by state, there are nuances to all of these. The perfect example is that 401k. I have 100,000 premarital. Some states say the growth is marital and some say the growth is non-marital. So you do need to understand your situation, your state, make sure. And that sometimes, again, where working with a professional can be very, very helpful.
Thank you. That was super helpful. I also want to, through one of my own mistakes, I want to identify the importance of documentation. So, when we moved from our marital home to a new home in 2018, I threw away probably 20 years worth of documentation. And, my thought process behind that is I don't need it. I probably only need 5 to 7 years, which most organizations keep records that long. The thought of divorce never even crossed my mind because I thought we had the perfect life at that time. And it's not really something that I planned for. So, when it came time to litigate, I didn't have documentation to prove, many of the things that we were discussing were actually premarital. And because of that, the onus of proof was on me. And in some cases, I was able to find, an old email, or an old document floating around. But in many cases, things became marital, even though it was premarital. So always take the extra caution, save the documents. If you don't want to keep physical documents, scan them. But know that most organizations typically don't hold documentation past 5 or 7 years. That's your responsibility.
Right. I would say check with them, but don't be too hopeful. Be cautiously optimistic, I guess, because every now and then you run into organizations that do. But again, if you don't do the legwork, you've lost the money automatically.
So here's another question. What is the most expensive mistake you see people make frequently when it comes to valuing or categorizing assets?
I don't think they look inside. They look at it as a business. This comes back to what I was saying earlier. So often, especially sole proprietors of very small companies, they pass a lot of things through the business. Another example is somebody commutes, or I've even had a case, I'll give you one example, literally works from home, does not travel, was charging about $16,000 or $17,000 a year to automobiles. Well, that was both his and the spouse's automobile, but he just put that as travel through the business. So if somebody owns a small business, there's a very high likelihood, you can't guarantee it, obviously, but there's a high likelihood that that's going to be something that comes through. So I do think that's something important. Another one that people often forget, I kind of mentioned this before, somebody often dominating personality will talk about my retirement. And I've actually had clients where I've got to say to them, when you talk about it, it's our retirement accounts, it's our brokerage, whatever it might be. You need to change the tune for yourself, sometimes more than the other person, because you'd be amazed at how often people say, oh, he's keeping his retirement. Why? It's double yours. Those are big mistakes that people are making.
And I also think it's important for people to understand not all dollars are equal. A dollar of retirement isn't necessarily equal to a dollar in the bank account. So, Hirsh, can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll give you an example, which will, I think, highlight it tremendously. Had a client that had about $2.25 million in retirement assets, right? And this isn't even saying retirement versus non-retirement. This is all under the retirement umbrella. Well, he said, I have, of that 2.25, he had about 1.5 and she had about 750,000. So he said, well, I got 750,000. I'll just give you half of that from my 401k. We'll do Quadro, will move it over. When I looked at the accounts, he had almost $300,000 in Roth IRAs. She had none. So what he was going to do is say, you get half, I get half. Oh, but of my half, roughly 1.1 million, 300,000 of that was going to be tax-free when he retired. 0 of hers. take 25%, you've just saved 75 grand in taxes. And I think potentially 25% can be on the low side, depending on the state, etc. But that's one example. Every dollar is not equal to every other dollar. So you got to look at, is it pre-tax, meaning I haven't paid tax and I will have to, versus post-tax, like I have already paid taxes on this. Your typical brokerage account, you pay as you go. Usually at the end of the year, we're on December 10th. By April of this coming year in 26, you'll have caught up all the taxes on that brokerage account. Effectively, that's after tax money. But a 401k that's been put in a traditional K, that's going to have to be taxed when you withdraw that money.
So this information just really highlights why including a professional like Hirsh is so important in your divorce process, because you could be leaving tens, hundreds, even millions of dollars on the table if you don't understand these nuances regarding tax and other things. So one of the things I tell every one of my clients is you can't negotiate a fair settlement if you don't know what you actually need to live and if you don't know what you have. So I'm not talking about a vague idea of your expenses. I'm talking about real, actual line by line budget. And what people don't realize is you actually need two budgets, one for during the divorce process and one for your life after. So Hirsh, can you kind of talk about these two different budgets during the divorce and post-divorce?
I'd love to actually, I love this question. I want to tell two of my favorite stories with this because it illustrates how important it is. I had a client, I'm not going to say, but a very rich neighborhood, was going to leave with about 2.8 million. And she says to me, Hirsh, 2.8 million, I should be fine, right? And I said to her, I don't know. And she looks at me like, you're the finance guy. And I said, well, you've been living basically a $500,000 distance. That's about a 6-year run. And she was in her early 50s. 6 years certainly wasn't going to do it. I said, are you going to cut back on your spend? Because I'm just making it up. You go to a $200,000 budget. Well, that 2.8 million is going to last you significantly longer. That's one example. The other one was, I had a client, they were this close to a settlement. He turned around to her and said, just give me a number that you need for maintenance, which used to be called alimony. And she looked at him and said, I don't know. So again, the budget, as you pointed out, is going to be vitally, vitally important. So there's two. One is going to be, as you go through your divorce, you're going to incur costs that you don't incur necessarily afterwards, right? You may go to therapy more. And by the way, I do recommend that you take care of your emotional needs. There are lawyer bills that, yeah, sometimes they filter beyond the divorce, but most of them are coming through the divorce. You may be hiring other professionals. You might need someone, for example, like Justin, who can really walk you through the process objectively and guide you through it, because he's dealt with many, including his own, as he's mentioned, versus, hey, I'm going to wing this. I'm going to take it as it comes. I think those kind of professionals, myself, others, are vitally important. Use the right professional for the right task as well. Right? I think going to your attorney, going to depositions and court case, all those things people don't think about. Well, you might need extra daycare for your kids. Those are going to be extra costs, right? There are a lot of costs like that. Then you've got to think, and I always think it's important to keep a focus beyond the divorce. And it's not easy always, but that's where someone like Justin becomes so important. He's going to help you envision, what does my life look like beyond? Well, that's going to also come down to, what does a budget look like beyond, right? Realistically, if they're two households with the same income, there are things that are going to have to be scaled back. How do I do that? Well, let's identify your values, your priorities. Let's understand what are the most important of all of those to you and fight for those at least. Have some joy in your life because you're living a values-based life. So again, beyond the divorce is important. I'll tell you another trick that I do. I don't do the traditional money in, money out for a budget. It's always good to have a budget. I look at it as, let's look at your essential spend. What do you absolutely need? And that can change pre and post divorce very often. You will. Then I fully load your life. Let's look at your discretionary spend, right? I call it the Lifetime Fitness or the LA Fitness, $300 to $30 kind of thing, right? I don't want to cut anything out if I can still keep it in there. But hey, $270, you've saved over $3,000 a year just on that one item, right? Not common to save a lot on every item, but it adds up very quickly. But if you do it this way and you know your values, it also helps you go through the divorce. What do you want? What can you not go below? What are all your values that you want to build in, it helps you build a strategy financially to go into a negotiation and know where you want to come out and where you want to start and where you cannot go below. All very, very important pieces to that. But again, divorce, some of the things anyway, you may cover all of the housing, you may have your own health insurance. The children, if there's daycare, you might have to cover while it's on your custody time. Food is going to be 100% yours. These are all just some of the items that are going to be covered post-divorce that you need to build in. And again, having a structure on how to build that, put it together, have a budget is a very, very important piece with that. You also got to understand what debt's going to come out and how you're going to attack that.
Super helpful. And I think it's important that people really understand that budgeting and financial planning are two different things. So,
Very much.
at some point, the divorce is going to end and you're going to move on. Assets are going to be divided and you're going to focus on living your best life. So one needs to take into consideration short-term, medium-term, and long-term financial planning. And what does financial planning really mean? It means setting up your goals, link them to your values, and what do you want your future to look like? And if you have a plan, there's a good chance you're going to reach it, and someone like Hirsh can help you get there. But if you just coast, you're likely not going to reach it, and the money problems and challenges you may have today may be the same problems you have in 10 years. So, Hirsh, can you walk us through what short-term, medium-term, and long-term financial planning actually looks like in the context of divorce? And I know for many people, it's probably hard for them to think this way because their life as they know it is falling apart.
Right.
But it's also important that you have to think beyond the chaos that you're currently in.
Okay. So I'm ultimately going to speak on a high level, but I want to point out this also differs based on kind of what stage of life you're in. For example, you have 3 small kids, you're going to be planning very differently than if you've got 3 kids that are married and established in their work and have their own families, right? Because at that point, college is paid for or weddings are paid for, whatever it might be. Those are things that you don't have to plan for or think about. If you have kids in high school, you got to think, well, in that medium term, it might be 5 to 10 years, or depending what you consider medium, you're going to have weddings. How do we pay for that? What are we going to do? Or, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, we're going to have people in college, kids in college. So it does depend where you are kind of in your timeline as well. But short-term things you just got to understand as well. So short-term is you need liquidity. You need to get through the legal process as it is right now. That's probably going to be part, not all of your, let's say, 0 to 2 year time frame. So even that can change a little bit. You've got to change things over. You've got to change your bank accounts. You've got to change your credit cards. You've got to take them off, change all your passwords, come up with new passwords. Things like that are going to be very important. If you have 2 incomes, as an example, you've got a buffer should there be an emergency. The water heater goes out, it's going to cost you $1,000 or $1,500. Well, we've got 2 incomes. We've got a little excess potentially. We're going to be okay. If you've only got 1 income, you may not have that excess. So now we've got to build 3 to 6 months at a minimum, really, an emergency fund for something that might go out like that. Your health insurance, often when people get divorced, they want the other person to have life insurance that, God forbid, something happens, they can defray the cost for the children, especially if they're younger. These are all things that you got to think about right away. You don't want to get a 1 or 2 year or maybe even a 5-year policy. You want to look at a 10, 15, 20-year policy. Again, that's going to depend a little bit on your age. If you're 25, 55, very different costs. The medium, depending on who you are and what your age is, medium can be 2 years, 5 years, in that range. Sometimes people will look at 7 or 8 years. But these are things where, well, do I want to buy a home? My kids might be going to college. I need to now rebuild my savings, my retirement. I've got debt. Boy, I don't want to be paying 25, 30% on my debt. I would really start with that even earlier. But again, sometimes we're just getting through the divorce before we can even think about actually attacking our debt, because the lawyer fees, whatever, might be what's actually causing that debt to occur. 529 plans. How are we going to afford college? These are very, very important questions to be asking yourself. That long term should always be on the horizon, and quite honestly, it should not be cut off today and only started 5 or 10 years down the road. The classic one being retirement, especially if your employer matches. At a minimum, get that match. So if they're going to match 3, whatever it takes, get that 3%. It's a 3% bonus. and it's going to be yours after the divorce. You don't have to split that. I've had people come to me and say, hey, I want to build a budget. I want to retire in, 15 years. And they've got, 20 or $50,000 in retirement. And I'm like, hold on, you want to retire in 15 years and live off that for 20? Let's set up the reality of that, right? You're not going to be able to, unfortunately, save in 15 years enough to do that. If you have the capacity, can you leave some legacy planning to your children? And understanding Social Security, by the way, is a very big one, because if you are the spouse who earns a lot less, you have choices. I don't want to get too much into it. It gets technical, but understand what those choices are. Again, we've spoken about understanding your situation. This is a piece of it. I'm sure there's more, but again, covered a lot. I think those are good pieces for people to digest as well. One thing I do want to point out, and this can be short or middle term, you do need to think about redoing some estate planning. The big one that I always tell people is, and this kind of drives it home, if your POA, that authority is in the hands of your ex on your health or your financial decisions, God forbid something happens to you, they're the ones that are going to say, pull the plug. You may want to change that decision, right? Make sure those POAs, those power of attorneys, are updated to somebody that you have a much better relationship with at this point.
Yeah, that's great advice. And, kind of leading into my next question about the documents that we need to focus on getting updated once the divorce is complete. But before we kind of get there, you're talking about so many things, so many different acronyms. I could see how someone would get very overwhelmed. And I think, just for anyone who's listening, I think this is where it's really important to have the right team in place. I think a divorce coach, someone like me who has a background in the financial component, and someone who can go much deeper like Hirsh, doesn't necessarily have to be us, but having that team and your attorney, of course, is so critical, because the things that you don't know or understand right now when you're at the table negotiating, you could miss out on some really great opportunities. And yesterday I did a podcast on mediation. And what I see so often is just people not prepared for mediation. And when I say not prepared, they don't really understand the marital balance sheet. They don't understand the value of a traditional Roth versus traditional IRA versus a Roth IRA, and all these other sorts of things. It's a really good investment, not just financially, but with your own emotion, to be able to understand what it is you're doing. Because if you get it done right now, you won't have regrets in the future, and, you can co-parent more effectively and move on with life. So that's just a little bit of advice. So let's talk about, once you actually get your decree, some of the documents and things you can't update while you're going through the divorce.
Right.
For example, beneficiaries on life insurance policies. Of course, it depends on jurisdiction, but can you talk, Hirsh, about what documents must be updated once your divorce decree is signed and you're officially divorced?
I will. I just want to come back to what you've just said and how important it is. It took me about 3 or 4 years, and I realized my clients were not being prepared for mediation, to the degree that I went and took 40 hours of training to become a trained mediator, just so I could prepare my clients better. They walking into a negotiation without a plan. You're going into the negotiation, you got to understand, what is my financial picture? What are my needs? What are my values? What do I want out of this? What can I use to get more of what I want? When you ask your sister or your father or whatever, they have all the right intentions, but they're not familiar with what's going on to the degree that a divorce coach is, or someone like myself. So you do need a lot of prep to go into that as well. I think that's vital. There are a lot of them. I touched on, the estate plan, and my understanding, again, not an attorney, but my understanding is a will, a living will, power of attorney for medical, every account that's joined, updating beneficiaries. And that's not just on insurance like life insurance or something like that, but who's on your IRA, who's on your 401k. Those are ones that are very often forgotten. We always think about the incoming, who's on my side, what do I need to do on my documents? But if I'm the power of attorney for my ex, I don't know that I really want to be the power of attorney on their finances. And then their whole family is going to come after me if I make a decision that they don't like. So that's another side of it that I think people often forget. Deeds on properties, cars, all these kind of things. I'm actually dealing with one where somebody literally handed the deed to their spouse and they died. And now they've got a deed in hand of an ex without it being signed. And it's not easy for that person to go through. Now they've got to kind of go through the rigmarole of proving and bringing the MSA and all the rest that comes with that. So I would just look at everything you have and think, who is on that? Do I need to change it?
That's great advice. Hirsh, this has been incredibly valuable. We've covered a ton of ground, from document gathering to budgeting to long-term planning to estate planning to the mistakes people have made. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final piece of wisdom. If someone's listening to this right now and they're thinking about divorce, or maybe they're going through it right now, what is one piece of advice you would give them?
You need to be engaged in your divorce. A big mistake is I hired a great attorney. They'll take care of everything. You do need to be engaged, but at the same time, you need to be gentle. You need to be deliberate and focused, and you need to look beyond the divorce and plan for beyond. As you said in the intro, this is the first chapter of the rest of your life, not the last chapter in that part of your life.
That's amazing advice. And as you were saying this, it kind of reminds me of business school, where I think it was in my marketing class. Our professor always said to us, you're going to negotiate a deal that you're going to feel okay about. No one's going to feel great with the deal that they have. If that's the case, it's always one-sided, and that causes problems further down the line. So Hirsh, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
The easiest way is to go to my website, Lifecycle Financial. It's the name of the company, lifecycle.financial. I would recommend going. I have blogs for you to read that are very relevant, some of it on tax, which is also extremely relevant right now. I think one of my last posts, 32 financial impact or faux pas, basically. The other thing is go to the contact page, reach out to me. Let me know how I can help, because most people really do need help, even if it's just kind of getting the clutter organized on your financial life.
And I can, speak from experience. Hirsh is a rock star. You need someone like him on your team. So let's bring this home. If you take nothing else from this episode, take this. The preparation you do before filing or mediation for divorce is absolutely critical. Financial clarity equals negotiation power. When you know what you have, when you know what it's worth, and you know what you need, you can't be bulldozed. You can't be manipulated, and you can't be taken advantage of. This is transformative divorce in action. This is you taking control of your narrative instead of letting the chaos control you. This is the reclaim phase, where you reclaim your financial power and clarity and your agency. Now, if you need help with this process, if you're overwhelmed, if you're not sure where to start, if you want someone walking alongside you, feel free to call Hirsh on the finance side. On the emotional and the process side, please give me a call. You can find me at reclaimandreboot.me. I work with clients one-on-one to navigate every aspect of their divorce with intention and strategy, not just reaction and emotion. I've also written 2 books that can help you. You 2.0, Divorce a Better Way Forward, and the You 2.0 workbook, which is filled with practical tools and exercises for exactly this kind of financial preparation, emotional mastery, and co-parenting excellence. Both are available on Amazon and on my website. If this episode was helpful, do me a favor, subscribe to the Conscious Divorce podcast wherever you listen, leave a rating and review. It really does help other people find these podcasts to help them through their own process. You can also connect with me on Instagram at Reclaim and Reboot, or find me on LinkedIn. I share insights often on transformation, transformative divorce, co-parenting strategies, and life design. And finally, a huge thank you to Hirsh Thurman from Lifecycle Financial for sharing your expertise with us today. If people want to learn more about your work at Lifecycle Financial or connect with you directly, visit lifecycle.financial. Hirsh, thanks again. You've given people a roadmap they can actually use. To everyone listening, remember, divorce is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of You 2.0. It's the breakdown that becomes the breakthrough. It's the moment you get to redesign your life with intention. And it all starts with being financially prepared. Thanks for listening. I'm Justin, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Conscious Divorce Podcast.